Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The 11 p.m. session.
It was just an ordinary Friday night. I had nothing special planned, just a quiet evening to myself. The idea of spending another night binge-watching shows at home didn't really appeal to me, so I decided to do something different, something I hadn't done in a long time. I'd go see a movie. There's this old cinema in town, the Grand Palace. It's the kind of place that has been around for decades, with its faded marquee and worn-out seats. Most people these days prefer the newer, flashier theaters, but there was something about the palace that always intrigued me. It had this air of mystery, like it was hiding stories within its walls. I remember walking through the dimly lit streets leading up to the cinema. The town felt quieter than usual, almost eerily so. The few streetlights that still worked flickered as I passed by, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and follow me. But I brushed off the unsettling feeling. I was just letting my imagination run wild. When I arrived at the Grand Palace, the entrance was nearly deserted. A small group of people was leaving, chatting in hushed tones, but other than that, it was just me and the old woman behind the ticket counter. She looked at me with a strange smile, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "One for the 11 p.m. showing," I said, sliding a crumpled bill across the counter. She didn't say a word, just handed me the ticket with that same unsettling smile. As I took it, I felt a slight chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the cold draft that always seemed to linger in old buildings like this. The theater lobby was empty, the kind of empty that makes you feel like you've stumbled into a place forgotten by time. The popcorn machine hummed softly, but there was no one around to tend it. I didn't bother buying any snacks. I just wanted to get inside and find a good seat. As I pushed open the heavy doors to the auditorium, the musty smell of old carpet and aged wood hit me. It was dark, except for the dim glow of the screen showing pre-movie advertisements. I took a moment to let my eyes adjust before I walked down the aisle. That's when I noticed it, the figure. Sitting alone in the back row, hunched over slightly, with a hood pulled up over their head. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the flickering screen. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should sit closer to the front, but something about sitting alone in the middle of the theater felt right. Besides, it's not like the person in the back was bothering me. I chose a seat a few rows from the front, dead center, perfect for immersing myself in the movie. As I settled in, the lights dimmed further, and the previews started. The quiet hum of the projector, the rustling of old velvet seats, it all added to the nostalgic charm of the place. But as the previews rolled on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced back once more at the hooded figure, but they hadn't moved. They just sat there, staring at the screen. Maybe they were just really into the previews, I thought. But there was something unsettling about their stillness, like they were waiting for something, waiting for me to turn away. I turned back to face the screen, trying to push the unease out of my mind. I was here to enjoy a movie, after all. But as the film began, the chill that had settled in my bones didn't fade. If anything, it grew colder. And that was when I started to realize that tonight was going to be anything but ordinary. As the movie started, I tried to relax and lose myself in the story unfolding on the screen. It was a classic horror film, one of those slow burn types where the tension builds with every passing minute. Normally, this was exactly my kind of movie, the kind that makes you squirm in your seat, anticipating the next scare. But tonight, something felt off, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I kept telling myself it was just nerves. Maybe the emptiness of the theater, combined with the shadowy figure in the back, was getting to me. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the movie, my attention kept drifting. My eyes would dart back to the screen, then flicker to the corners of the theater, searching for something, anything, that could explain the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. The film's audio seemed slightly off, like it was a half-second out of sync with the action on the screen. I chalked it up to the age of the equipment in this old theater. After all, the Grand Palace wasn't exactly known for state-of-the-art technology. Still, the dissonance was unsettling, adding to the growing sense of unease. I tried to shake it off, but the cold air in the theater seemed to seep into my bones. It wasn't just the usual chill of an old, underheated building. This was different, colder, more invasive, like the air itself was charged with something unnatural. My gaze kept drifting back to the hooded figure. They hadn't moved an inch since I first noticed them, still sitting in that same hunched position, as if frozen in place. The longer I stared, the more details I noticed. The way their head seemed to tilt slightly toward the screen, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of their shoulders as they breathed. It was as if they were watching the movie with an intensity one couldn't understand. A sharp crackle pulled me back to the screen, where the film was briefly distorted, the image warping as if the reel was about to break. The projector's hum grew louder, then quieted again as the picture returned to normal. But the sound, it wasn't right. There were moments when it seemed to fade in and out, like someone was tampering with the volume. A few minutes later, the lights in the theater flickered. Just once, quickly enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been on edge. But then it happened again, a little longer this time. The sudden shifts between light and dark were disorienting, making me feel like I was caught between two worlds, the one on the screen and the one around me. My discomfort grew into a gnawing anxiety. I couldn't concentrate on the movie anymore. My thoughts kept returning to that figure in the back row. I forced myself to glance back again, hoping to find some reassurance in their presence, maybe see them shift or move like a normal person. But they remained eerily still, a dark silhouette that seemed to merge with the shadows around them. I turned back to the screen, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just as caught up in the movie as I should have been. But that cold presence I felt earlier, it was back, and it was stronger. It felt like someone or something was sitting right next to me, just out of sight. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could have sworn I felt a faint breath against my skin, cold and uninvited. Panic began to creep in. I started to consider leaving, but a part of me didn't want to appear scared, didn't want to admit that a stupid old theater and a quiet stranger could unnerve me like this. I told myself I was overreacting, that I should just sit back, relax, and enjoy the movie. But when I tried to settle in again, the lights flickered once more, this time accompanied by a faint but distinct sound. A whisper, too low to make out the words but close enough that I could feel it in my ear. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn and look, to see if there was someone, or something, there. But I was too terrified to move. It felt like the theater itself was alive, breathing down my neck, and the hooded figure in the back was watching, waiting for something I couldn't understand. The movie continued, oblivious to my fear, but I wasn't watching anymore. I was too busy fighting the urge to run, to escape this place before whatever was lurking in the darkness decided to reveal itself. That was when I knew this wasn't just a movie anymore. This was something else, something much more real and much more terrifying. I couldn't take it anymore. My nerves were frayed, and the tension in the theater was unbearable. The movie droned on, but I wasn't paying attention to it. My entire focus was on the oppressive atmosphere around me, the flickering lights, the distorted sounds, and the cold, suffocating presence that seemed to be closing in on me. I had to leave. I stood up, my legs shaky, and turned toward the aisle. But as I did, the screen flickered again, plunging the theater into complete darkness. The sudden shift was disorienting, and for a few terrifying moments, I couldn't see anything, not even the faint outline of the seats around me. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to use its light to find my way out. But when I pressed the button, nothing happened. The screen stayed dark, unresponsive. I tried again, but it was like the battery had drained in an instant. I was completely cut off from any source of light. A low, almost imperceptible whisper floated through the air, echoing off the walls. It was the same sound I'd heard earlier, but this time it was clearer, closer. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to make out the words, but they were just out of reach, like a language I couldn't understand. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides, and the air grew thicker, heavier, making it hard to breathe. I felt like I was being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes. I wanted to scream, to demand that whoever or whatever was playing this sick game reveal themselves, but my voice was caught in my throat. I started to move toward the exit, my hands outstretched to feel for the edges of the seats, but as soon as I took a step, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a creak, like the sound of an old floorboard under pressure, coming from behind me. I froze, my mind racing. The hooded figure. Had they moved? Were they following me? I forced myself to turn around, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. But I saw nothing, just the impenetrable blackness that filled the theater. The creaking sound came again, closer this time, followed by another whisper, this one more insistent, almost like a command. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about looking scared anymore. I just needed to escape this nightmare. I reached the aisle and started to run, but the moment I did, the lights flickered back on. The sudden brightness was blinding, and I stumbled, nearly falling over. I looked back at the screen, hoping that maybe the interruption was over, that I could leave this place behind. But what I saw made my stomach drop. The hooded figure was gone. The seat where they had been sitting was empty, the darkness behind it yawning like an open maw. I scanned the theater, my eyes darting from row to row, but there was no sign of them. It was like they had vanished into thin air. Panic surged through me. I turned back toward the exit, determined to leave, but as I reached for the door handle, I realized with horror that the doors were locked. I jiggled the handle, pulled and pushed with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Desperation clawed at me. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the theater's thick, suffocating silence. It was as if the building itself was alive, and it wanted to keep me inside. And then, from behind me, I heard it, a slow, deliberate footstep. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The figure was standing in the middle of the aisle, no longer in the shadows, but fully visible under the dim theater lights. The hood still obscured their face, but I could see their hands, pale, almost translucent, hanging limply at their sides. They stood there, motionless, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I backed up against the door, my eyes locked on the figure. The air around me grew colder, and the light above flickered, casting the figure in a stuttering, nightmarish glow. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step forward, and then another, moving slowly, deliberately, as if savoring my terror. With each step, the lights flickered more violently, the whispers growing louder, more frenzied, until they filled the entire theater, surrounding me in a cacophony of voices. I tried to speak, to plead, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was watch as the figure approached, the air around me growing colder and colder until it felt like I was being suffocated by ice. And then, just as they reached me, the lights went out again, plunging me back into darkness. But this time, I wasn't alone. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything around me. I couldn't see a thing, not even my own hand in front of my face. My breathing was ragged, echoing in my ears as I stood there, frozen in place. The terror was paralyzing, a suffocating blanket that wrapped itself around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I could feel the presence right next to me, cold, oppressive, and so close I could almost feel it pressing against my skin. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a desperate plea for escape, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the inky blackness with something I couldn't see but knew was there. Then, a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Breathing. It wasn't mine, it was slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. I strained to see, to make out any shape or form in the darkness, but there was nothing, only the sensation of being watched, of something unseen lurking just inches away. I wanted to scream, to do anything to break the silence, but I couldn't. My voice was caught in my throat, strangled by fear. I could feel the presence circling me, moving silently through the blackness, its breath cold against my neck. I clenched my fists, trying to summon the courage to move, to run, but it was like I was trapped in a nightmare, my body betraying me at the worst possible moment. Suddenly, the whispering started again, but this time it was clearer, more defined. The words were still unintelligible, like they were being spoken in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening, malevolent, like the voice of something ancient and evil. The sound seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls of the theater, enveloping me in a cocoon of terror. I felt a sharp, icy chill on my arm, like the brush of fingers against my skin. I jerked away instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The cold followed me, relentless, creeping along my arm, up my neck, and into my very bones. I stumbled back, desperately trying to escape, but the darkness seemed to close in on me, suffocating and impenetrable. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The cold receded, but the fear remained, a gnawing pit in my stomach. I was alone in the dark again, but the presence, It hadn't left. I could feel it, lurking just out of reach, waiting for me to let my guard down. I pressed my back against the door, feeling the rough wood against my spine. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape this nightmare. My hand found the handle again, and I tried to force it open, but it was no use. The door was still locked, as if the theater itself was conspiring to keep me trapped. In the distance, I heard a faint creaking sound, like the floorboards of an old house settling. It was followed by another, closer this time. My breath hitched in my throat as the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving through the theater, coming closer with each step. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, as the footsteps drew nearer. My mind raced, searching for any possible explanation, any way to rationalize what was happening, but there was none. This was real, and whatever was out there was coming for me. The footsteps stopped, and I felt the presence again, closer than ever. It was right in front of me. I could feel its cold breath on my face, hear the low, steady rhythm of its breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to go away, but the feeling only grew stronger, more oppressive, until I thought I would suffocate under the weight of it. Then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered back on, dim and flickering, casting long shadows across the theater. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness, and looked around wildly. The theater was empty, just rows of seats stretching out before me. The figure was gone, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I could still feel the remnants of the presence, like a lingering chill in the air. I knew it hadn't left. It was still here, hiding just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. My gaze was drawn to the screen, where the movie was still playing, oblivious to the horror unfolding in the theater. But something was wrong. The picture was distorted, the colors bleeding together in unnatural ways, and the sound was warped, a low, guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I tore my eyes away from the screen, focusing instead on the exit. I had to leave, had to get out of this place before it was too late. I turned back to the door, and this time, when I pushed on the handle, it gave way. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. I hesitated, one foot in the theater, the other in the hallway, caught between the safety of the light and the terror that lurked in the darkness behind me. I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the figure standing there, waiting for me, but the theater was empty. I stepped into the hallway, my heart still pounding, and let the door close behind me. The click of the latch echoed through the empty corridor, and I felt a brief surge of relief. I was out. I was safe. But as I hurried down the hall, the whispering started again, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It followed me, growing louder with each step, until it was all I could hear. I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing in the deserted hallway, but no matter how fast I went, the whispering kept pace, relentless and unyielding. I burst through the exit doors, stumbling into the cool night air. I didn't stop until I was a good distance away from the theater, my chest heaving, my heart still racing with fear. I looked back at the Grand Palace, its facade dark and foreboding in the night. I was out of the theater, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The whispering had stopped, but its echo lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of what I had encountered in that cursed place. And as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't help but feel that something, some unseen terror, had followed me out into the night. I stood outside the Grand Palace, gasping for breath as the cold night air hit my face. The neon lights of the theater flickered weakly above me, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. I was out, but the relief I expected to feel never came. The whispering had stopped, but its memory clung to me, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but when I looked at the screen, it was dead. The battery, which had been at 60% when I entered the theater, was now completely drained. A sense of dread washed over me. It was as if the theater had taken something from me, leaving me vulnerable and alone. I glanced back at the entrance, half expecting to see the figure in the hood standing there, watching me. But the door was closed, and the street was empty. The city seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The silence was oppressive, filled with the echoes of the terror I had just experienced. I needed to leave, to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The streets were deserted, every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and every sound was amplified in the empty silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the presence from the theater had followed me. As I walked, the events of the night replayed in my mind. Those cold whispers, the oppressive darkness, the figure that seemed to dissolve into the shadows. None of it made any sense, and yet it felt all too real. My rational mind struggled to comprehend what I had witnessed, but deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had happened in that theater wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was far from over. The streets twisted and turned. The familiar path home now seemed foreign, almost hostile. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that something was lurking just out of sight. I quickened my pace, my pulse racing with fear. My mind was racing, replaying every detail, every sound, every shadow that had moved in the corner of my eye. When I finally reached my apartment building, I practically sprinted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. The hallway was dimly lit, the bulbs flickering just like in the theater. I could feel that same oppressive cold creeping up on me, as if the presence was right there, just waiting to pounce. The door finally gave way, and I burst into my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. The silence of my apartment was a welcome relief, but it did little to calm my nerves. I knew that whatever I had encountered wasn't something I could just leave behind. I turned on every light in the apartment, needing the brightness to chase away the lingering shadows. But no matter how bright the lights were, the feeling of dread persisted. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone, that something had followed me out of the theater. I collapsed onto the couch, trying to steady my breathing, but every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind outside sent my heart racing. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating, the events of the evening replaying over and over in my mind. Sleep was impossible. I was too terrified to close my eyes, too afraid of what might happen if I let my guard down. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. It was hard to tell. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the wake of what I had experienced. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder that I was still here, still alive. But the relief was short-lived. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, I finally allowed myself to relax, just a little. The presence seemed to recede with the coming of the light, as if whatever had haunted me throughout the night was powerless in the face of the rising sun. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment, not after what had happened. The fear had burrowed deep into my soul, leaving me paranoid and on edge. I needed to leave the city, to put as much distance between myself and the Grand Palace as possible. But even as I packed a bag with trembling hands, I knew that running might not be enough. The theater wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. And that curse had latched onto me, refusing to let go. The whispers, the figure, the cold, it was all still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the darkness to return. As I stepped out of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I hurried down the stairs, glancing over my shoulder the entire time, half expecting to see the hooded figure standing there, watching me leave. When I finally stepped outside, the morning light offered some small comfort, but it wasn't enough to chase away the fear. I knew that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, the terror of that night would follow me. And as I walked away, leaving the Grand Palace and my apartment behind, I couldn't help but feel that I was only just beginning to understand the true horror of what had happened. Because the terror didn't end when I left the theater, it was with me now, a shadow that would haunt me for the rest of my life.
The Last Ticket.
It was supposed to be just another Friday night out with my friends. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and we thought a horror movie would be the perfect way to catch up and get our adrenaline pumping. The small-town theater wasn't much to look at. Old, worn down, with a musty smell that seemed to cling to the walls, but it had its charm. Plus, it was the only place in town showing the latest horror flick we'd been dying to see. We arrived just in time for the last showing, the 11 p.m. session. The lobby was almost empty, just a couple of people hanging around, probably waiting for a different movie. As we approached the ticket booth, the guy behind the counter gave us a strange look, like he was surprised anyone would be there at that hour. "You're lucky," he said, his voice a little too cheerful for the late hour. "Only 5 tickets left, and they're all together in the same row." It felt like fate. 5 tickets, 5 friends, it was perfect. We laughed it off, joked about it being meant to be, and handed over our money. The guy tore the tickets from his roll and handed them to us, but not before giving us that same strange look again. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just another bored employee trying to make it through the last shift of the night. The theater was nearly empty as we walked in, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the rows of seats. We found our row easily enough, middle of the theater, dead center. The perfect spot. As we settled in, I couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that filled the room. The usual pre-movie chatter was absent, and the few people who were there sat scattered in the dark, like ghosts waiting for something to happen. I took my seat, feeling the old cushion sag beneath me. To my right was Jessica, already scrolling through her phone, and to my left was an empty seat. I glanced at it, confused for a moment. We'd bought 5 tickets, but why was there an extra seat? I did a quick head count. Me, Jessica, Mike, Sarah, and Tom. 5 of us. I frowned, thinking maybe someone had bought a ticket earlier but hadn't shown up yet. The lights dimmed further, and the screen lit up with trailers for upcoming movies. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I leaned over to Jessica and whispered, "Did you notice the extra seat?" She glanced over and shrugged, clearly not as bothered as I was. "Probably someone who's running late. Don't worry about it." I nodded, trying to focus on the screen, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Something about that empty seat gnawed at me. It wasn't just that it was unoccupied, it was that it was there at all. I couldn't remember seeing it when we first sat down. But there it was, plain as day, waiting for someone who hadn't arrived. As the movie began, I forced myself to relax. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just the eerie vibe of the old theater playing tricks on me. I settled into my seat, determined to enjoy the film, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about that empty seat and why it felt like it shouldn't be there at all. As the movie began, I tried to lose myself in the storyline, the flickering screen and the eerie soundtrack designed to get under your skin. The film was full of jumps and scares, and I could feel my pulse quickening with each sudden noise. Despite the thrilling distraction, I kept glancing towards that empty seat next to me, feeling increasingly uneasy. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd. A figure had appeared in the vacant seat at the end of our row. The lights were too dim to see them clearly, but I could make out a silhouette dressed in dark clothing, a hooded figure whose presence seemed out of place. I nudged Jessica, pointing towards the end of the row. "Hey, do you see that?" She followed my gaze, her face scrunching up in confusion. "No, what are you talking about?" I felt a chill creep up my spine. The figure was still there, unmoving, seemingly fixated on the screen. I tried to focus back on the movie, but my mind kept drifting. The figure didn't shift, didn't make a sound. It was like it was carved out of the darkness, watching us with a sense of quiet intensity. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or maybe a shadow cast by the dim glow of the screen. But as the movie progressed, the figure's presence became more unsettling. It was almost as if it was staring directly at us, its gaze unblinking. I glanced over to my friends. Tom was now leaning forward, clearly absorbed in the film, and Mike was munching on popcorn, seemingly oblivious. The tension in the row was palpable. I could sense Jessica's discomfort. She kept shifting in her seat and occasionally peeking towards the figure. I could hear Sarah whispering to Tom, her voice trembling. "Do you think that person is even supposed to be here?" Tom shook his head, still watching the movie. "Maybe they just got a late pass or something. I don't know." I wanted to believe that, but something about the figure's presence felt wrong. They hadn't walked in with us, and their stillness was unnerving. As the film reached a particularly tense scene, the theater's lights flickered briefly, casting odd shadows across the room. For a moment, the figure seemed to move closer, or at least that's what it felt like. My heart raced, and I could barely keep my eyes off them. The sound of the movie's soundtrack crackled and cut out intermittently, adding to the atmosphere of dread. I could feel a cold draft brushing against my neck, as if someone, or something, was standing close by. My hands began to tremble, and I tried to ignore the growing sense of panic. I wanted to get up and leave, but I felt rooted to my seat, unable to tear my gaze away from that strange presence. The movie finally reached its climax, and I could see the figure shifting slightly in the periphery of my vision. I hoped desperately that they'd leave before the end of the film, but they remained seated, a constant, unsettling presence. As the credits began to roll and the lights slowly came back on, I turned to look at the figure again, only to find that they hadn't moved. My friends were already standing and gathering their belongings, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the end of the row. The figure was still there, unmoving, and I was struck by a sudden sense of dread. I knew we needed to leave, but I felt paralyzed, caught between curiosity and fear. As the movie ended and the theater lights began to brighten, I felt a wave of relief. The oppressive atmosphere of the theater was finally lifting, but my unease didn't dissipate. I glanced nervously at the end of the row, where the hooded figure had been sitting. To my dismay, the seat was now empty. I scanned the theater, hoping to catch a glimpse of the person leaving, but there was no sign of them. "Hey, did you see where that person went?" I asked Jessica, who was now standing beside me and gathering her belongings. She looked confused. "What person? I thought you were just imagining things." "No, there was definitely someone sitting there," I insisted, pointing to the empty seat. "They didn't move or leave when the movie ended." Jessica gave me a skeptical look, but before she could respond, Tom, Mike, and Sarah joined us. "Let's get out of here," Tom said, clearly eager to leave. "This place gives me the creeps." I hesitated for a moment, still looking for any sign of the hooded figure. My heart sank when I noticed something on the floor where the figure had been sitting. I bent down and picked it up, my breath catching in my throat as I saw that it was a torn movie ticket. The edges were frayed, and the paper was yellowed with age. But what made my skin crawl was the date written on it, a date from decades ago. "What's that?" Sarah asked, peering over my shoulder. "It's a ticket," I said, my voice trembling. "But look at the date. It's from a movie that was shown years before any of us were born." The group gathered around, and a sense of unease spread among us. The ticket was old, clearly from a time long before our visit. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Mike suggested, trying to sound rational. "Someone must have dropped it here before." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The eerie presence of the hooded figure and now this old ticket seemed too coincidental. I glanced back at the rows of seats, half expecting to see the figure reappear, but the theater was now empty except for us. As we exited the cinema, the night air felt uncomfortably cold, and I shivered despite the warmth of my jacket. The strange experience lingered in my mind, and I noticed my friends were also unnerved. We walked to the parking lot in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. Once we were in the car, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Has anyone else been feeling like something's not right?" The others exchanged worried glances. "Yeah," Jessica admitted. "I've been feeling on edge ever since we saw that figure." We all agreed that something about the night felt off, but none of us could quite put our finger on it. As we drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had somehow crossed into a realm beyond the ordinary, a place where past and present were disturbingly intertwined. The old ticket burned a hole in my pocket as I replayed the night's events in my mind. It seemed that whatever we had encountered at the theater was far from ordinary, and the sense of dread I felt was only growing stronger. We had no idea what we were about to face, but I knew one thing for sure: the night at the cinema was far from over. The following days were a blur of normalcy and creeping unease. I tried to shake off the strange encounter at the cinema, telling myself it was just a figment of my imagination, but the eerie events kept resurfacing in my thoughts. I couldn't escape the feeling that the incident was more than a coincidence. Late one evening, while I was alone at home, the tension reached a new level. I had been working on my laptop when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the front door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or perhaps a stray branch hitting the window, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I stood up, my heart pounding, and went to check the door. The porch light cast long shadows across the door, and I peered through the peephole. To my surprise, there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the night was still. I hesitated for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. When I opened the door, the cool night air rushed in, carrying with it a chill that made me shiver. I stepped outside, scanning the area, but saw no sign of anyone. I shrugged it off as a figment of my imagination and went back inside. As I locked the door, I noticed something strange. The old movie ticket, which I had left on the dining table, was now lying on the floor in the hallway. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. There was something unsettling about its presence, especially after the strange events at the cinema. I tried to dismiss it, but the discomfort grew with each passing minute. Later that night, I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. I could hear faint whispers coming from the living room, barely audible but distinct. I convinced myself it was just the house settling or my imagination running wild. But then, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving around the house. I crept out of bed, clutching a flashlight and trying to keep my breathing steady. I moved through the darkened house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold draft brushing against my skin. I reached the living room and switched on the light, but the room was empty. Everything seemed normal, except for the fact that the ticket was now lying in the middle of the living room floor. I picked it up again, my hands trembling. The date on it seemed to glow ominously in the dim light. I placed it back on the table, trying to calm myself down. As I was about to turn off the light and head back to bed, I heard a sudden bang from the kitchen. I rushed in, finding nothing out of place. I was on edge, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, wide awake, every creak and whisper in the house amplifying my fears. The movie ticket seemed to have a life of its own, its presence growing increasingly sinister. My mind raced with thoughts of the hooded figure and the strange events that had followed. As dawn approached, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something was lurking just out of sight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the haunting had only just begun. The days following that unsettling night felt like they dragged on forever. Each morning, I woke up with a growing sense of dread, unable to escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The old movie ticket remained a constant reminder of the horrors I couldn't explain. Then, one evening, things took a turn for the worse. I was home alone again, trying to distract myself with a late-night movie, but my nerves were frayed. The shadows in my house seemed to dance with menace, and every little noise set my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the movie played, I heard a knock on the front door. My heart skipped a beat. It was late, way too late for anyone to be visiting. I hesitated, then went to check. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness outside. I opened the door cautiously, but the porch was empty. I closed it and locked it tightly, my anxiety growing. Back in the living room, I noticed something odd. The ticket was missing from the dining table. I scanned the room, searching for it, but it was nowhere to be found. My mind raced, trying to recall where I might have seen it last, when a sudden cold draft swept through the room, making me shiver. I followed the chill, feeling as though I was being guided by some unseen force. I moved through the darkened house, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers were back, louder now, filling the space with a dissonant hum. I turned the corner into the hallway, and there, on the floor, was the old movie ticket, wet and smeared, as though it had been handled roughly. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, but as I touched the ticket, a vision flashed before my eyes. I saw the hooded figure again, but this time it was standing in the middle of the theater, surrounded by darkness. The figure was not alone. There were others, similar in appearance, their faces obscured. They were all watching me, their eyes empty and cold. I stumbled back, dropping the ticket. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices. My head spun, and I felt a suffocating pressure, as if the house itself was closing in on me. I had to get out. I ran to the front door, but it was stuck. I pulled and yanked at it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I turned back, my mind racing for answers. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, filling the air with a malevolent energy. Then I remembered something. The ticket, the date on it was from a time when the theater had been closed for renovations, a fact I had learned from an old article I found online. The ticket didn't belong to anyone living, it belonged to someone from the past, someone who had never left the theater. I ran to the basement, searching for any old documents or clues that might explain what was happening. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. I finally came across a dusty box labeled Old Records. Inside, I found a file with the name of the theater's former owner. His picture was there, and he had the same vacant eyes as the figure I had seen. The realization hit me hard. The hooded figure wasn't just haunting the theater, it was somehow connected to the theater's past, a lingering spirit trapped in time. The ticket was a gateway, a connection between the living and the dead, and it was drawn to me because of my presence at the last showing. Desperate, I grabbed the ticket and ran back upstairs. The front door finally gave way, and I burst into the night, gasping for fresh air. I didn't stop until I was far from the theater, my heart pounding and my mind racing with the horrifying truth. I never went back to that theater, and I avoided any place that reminded me of that night. The experiences left me with an indelible mark, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed, and some tickets, especially the last ones, are better left alone.
The shadow on the screen.
I've always had a thing for horror movies. So when my friend suggested catching a late-night showing of a classic horror flick at the old independent theater in town, I was all in. It's one of those places that feels stuck in time, with creaky floors and musty old seats, but that's part of its charm. The theater is famous for its history and its reputation for being a bit eerie, which only added to the excitement. The movie was set to start at 11 p.m., the so-called last session, and we were looking forward to a night of classic chills. We bought our tickets from a young woman at the counter who gave us a strange smile as she handed us the last 5 tickets, all for the same row. "Enjoy the movie," she said, her eyes lingering on us with an intensity that I found oddly unsettling. "You're in for a real treat." We took our seats in the middle row, our anticipation building. The theater was dimly lit, casting long shadows on the walls, and the smell of old velvet and popcorn filled the air. We joked and laughed as we settled in, but the feeling of excitement was tempered by a strange, creeping unease. As the lights dimmed and the previews started, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced around the nearly empty theater, and my eyes landed on a lone figure sitting at the very end of our row. The person was draped in a dark hooded cloak, their face obscured by the hood. At first, I thought it might be a theater employee or someone there for a different movie, but there was no sign of movement. They were just sitting there, staring intently at the screen. I nudged my friend Jessica, whispering, "Do you see that person at the end of our row?" "They weren't here when we sat down." Jessica glanced over, her eyes widening slightly. "I didn't notice them before. It's kind of creepy." The movie began, and I tried to focus on the screen, but my attention kept drifting back to the hooded figure. They remained completely still, their head tilted slightly toward the screen. Despite the theater's eerie ambience, the figure's presence made it seem even more unsettling. Throughout the film, I kept stealing glances at the figure, who never moved, never looked away from the screen. The atmosphere in the theater grew increasingly tense, with the flickering images on the screen adding to the disquiet. It was as if the figure was a part of the movie itself, blending with the shadows and the eerie soundtrack. The movie was in full swing, and I tried my best to immerse myself in the plot. The tension on screen was palpable, but the presence of the hooded figure kept gnawing at the back of my mind. It wasn't just their strange, unblinking gaze that unsettled me. It was the way they seemed to blend into the darkness of the theater, almost like a part of the film itself. Every now and then, I'd glance over to see if the figure had moved or if they were still there. Each time, they were in the same position, the hood concealing their face in shadow. It was unnerving, but I tried to push it aside and enjoy the film with my friends. As the movie reached its climax, I noticed something odd. The lights in the theater started flickering intermittently, which I initially thought was just part of the old equipment acting up. The flickers grew more frequent, and the soundtrack seemed to stutter as well. The film's suspenseful music became erratic, creating an even more disconcerting atmosphere. I glanced over at the hooded figure again and was taken aback to see that they were now standing. They were still facing the screen, but their posture was rigid and unnatural. It felt as though they were part of the scene, like a spectral presence emerging from the darkness. My heart began to race, but I tried to stay calm, focusing on the film to avoid looking at the figure too much. As the movie came to its end, I was eager to leave. The unsettling experience had put me on edge, and the flickering lights only added to my anxiety. The theater was silent, save for the final moments of the film, and my friend seemed just as eager to get out as I was. When the credits began to roll, I looked back at the end of our row where the hooded figure had been. To my shock, they were gone. The seat was empty, and there was no sign of the mysterious person. I glanced around the theater, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread and stood up, gathering my friends. "Hey, did anyone else see that person at the end of our row? They were there the whole time, but now they're gone." Jessica frowned, looking back at the empty seat. I didn't see anyone leave. That's really weird. We made our way out of the theater, the oddity of the situation lingering in my mind. The eerie feeling refused to leave, even as we stepped into the cool night air. I couldn't shake the thought that the figure's sudden disappearance was anything but ordinary. As we walked to our cars, I noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper on the ground near the entrance. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. It was a ticket for the movie, but it looked old and worn, with a date from several decades ago. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the date was from a time long before the theater had even been renovated. I showed the ticket to my friends, and we all exchanged uneasy glances. Something about it just didn't sit right. The lingering feeling of unease followed us as we left the theater, the shadows of the night seeming to close in around us. The next few days were a blur of normalcy, or so I tried to convince myself. My mind kept drifting back to that strange night at the theater. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The ticket with the old date kept resurfacing in my thoughts, like a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. One evening, about a week after the movie, I was alone at home, trying to unwind. The living room was dimly lit, and I had a few candles flickering on the coffee table, hoping to recreate some of the ambience from that eerie night. I thought it might help me relax, but it only seemed to deepen my sense of unease. As I sat on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, I heard a faint rustling noise coming from the hallway. It was barely audible, but it was enough to make me pause. I held my breath, listening intently. The rustling continued, sounding like footsteps moving slowly down the hallway. I stood up cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, but there was no response. The noise had stopped as abruptly as it had started. I made my way to the hallway, but when I reached it, everything was eerily quiet. I checked each room, including the closets and under the beds, but there was no sign of anyone. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, a residual effect of the unsettling experience at the theater. Later that night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard the noise again. This time, it was clearer, the sound of something scratching at the door of my bedroom. It was faint, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I realized that the scratching was coming from the other side of the door. I mustered the courage to get up and open the door, but when I did, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, and there was no sign of disturbance. I could feel a cold draft, and the temperature in the room seemed to have dropped. My breath fogged up in the air as I tried to calm myself. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to check the security footage from the cameras I had set up around the house. I went through the footage from the past few nights, hoping to find something, anything that might explain the strange occurrences. The footage showed nothing out of the ordinary until I reached the night of the theater visit. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure moving past the camera in the hallway. It was the same hooded figure from the theater, or at least it looked remarkably similar. The figure appeared to pause near my bedroom door, and then the scratching noise began. My heart raced as I watched the figure move away from the camera and disappear. The footage was time-stamped for that same night we had gone to the theater. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the figure had somehow followed me home. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the camera, a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew that something was wrong. The presence that had followed me from the theater was now here, haunting my home. The sense of dread that had been creeping up on me was now a full-blown terror, and I knew that I needed to find answers before the nightmare became too real. After watching the footage, sleep was out of the question. Every creak, every shift in the house's foundation sent jolts of fear through me. I sat in the living room, the coldness from earlier still lingering in the air, clutching my phone, desperate to find a logical explanation for what was happening. I decided to reach out to my friends who had been with me at the theater that night. Maybe they had noticed something that I had missed, or maybe they too had experienced something strange since then. I started with Jessica. When I called, she picked up almost immediately, her voice tinged with nervousness. "I'm so glad you called," she said. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that night at the theater." A knot formed in my stomach. "What's been going on?" She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Ever since that night, I've had this feeling like I'm being watched. At first, I thought I was just paranoid, but then I started hearing things. Footsteps in my apartment, the sound of breathing when no one else is around." My heart skipped a beat. You've heard it too. Yes, she whispered. And that's not all. A couple of days ago, I found an old movie ticket in my purse. It wasn't from our night at the theater, though. The date on it was from decades ago, just like the one you found. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I've been hearing things as well, and I saw something on my security camera. A figure, like the one from the theater. I don't know what it means, but it's following me. Silence hung between us for a moment before Jessica spoke again. I think whatever this is, it's not just about the theater. It feels like it's connected to us, like it's latching onto us because we saw that figure. We agreed to meet up the next day, along with the rest of our group, to discuss what was happening and figure out a plan. But that night, things escalated. As soon as I hung up the phone, the temperature in my living room plummeted even further. My breath was visible in the cold air, and a sense of dread filled the room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I heard the scratching noise again, this time louder and more insistent. It was coming from the hallway, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The sound moved to the walls, as if something was crawling inside them, trying to get out. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, terrified of what might happen next. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker violently, casting the room in a series of rapid, disorienting flashes. In the chaos, I caught glimpses of a shadow darting across the walls, moving impossibly fast. It was the figure, I was sure of it, and it was inside my house. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. The scratching grew louder, more desperate, as if whatever was on the other side of the walls was getting closer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but logic had no place in what was happening. In a moment of sheer panic, I grabbed my keys and ran for the door. I needed to get out, to escape whatever was tormenting me. As I fumbled with the lock, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. The scratching stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I stood frozen in the darkness, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the power returned. The lights flickered back on, and the house was still, eerily quiet. The coldness lingered, but the presence was gone, or at least, it seemed to be. I bolted out of the house, my heart racing, and didn't stop running until I was safely inside my car. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Whatever had followed us from the theater was still with us, and it wasn't going to let us go that easily. The next day, I met up with the rest of the group. We gathered at Jessica's apartment, all of us visibly shaken and on edge. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and it was clear that each of us had experienced something terrifying since that night at the theater. As we sat down, I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. None of us knew what was happening, but we all felt that it was something far beyond our understanding. Jessica started by showing us the old ticket she had found in her purse, and as she placed it on the table, I pulled out mine. The dates were different, but the wear and tear, the faded ink, it was all too similar. "Has anyone else found anything like this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Paul, who had been mostly quiet up until now, reached into his pocket and pulled out a ticket that looked just like ours. "I found this under my pillow 2 nights ago," he said. I thought I was losing my mind. Megan and Tyler exchanged nervous glances before Megan spoke up. "We didn't find a ticket, but we've both been having the same dream, of that figure in the theater, just standing there, staring at us. It's always the same. We're in the movie, but we can't leave. The figure gets closer and closer until it's right in front of us, and then we wake up." The room fell silent as we all absorbed the gravity of what was happening. It wasn't just one of us, it was all of us. Whatever this was, it had linked us together, and it wasn't letting go. Desperation hung in the air as we discussed what to do next. We all knew we couldn't continue living in fear, but none of us had any answers. Finally, Jessica suggested we return to the theater. As insane as it sounded, it felt like the only way to confront whatever was haunting us. That evening, we gathered outside the old theater. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The building loomed before us, more ominous than ever. We hesitated at the entrance, but with a collective breath, we pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The theater was eerily quiet, just as it had been on that night. The air was thick with the scent of stale popcorn and something else, something colder, more sinister. We made our way to the auditorium where it all began, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As we entered the room, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The seats were empty, save for one figure sitting in the same spot at the back. The figure was hooded, motionless, just like before. "Is that?" Tyler whispered, but no one needed to answer. We all knew it was the same figure. We approached cautiously, every instinct telling us to turn and run, but something compelled us forward. The closer we got, the colder the air became, until it felt like we were walking through ice. When we were just a few feet away, the figure slowly turned its head to face us. The hood obscured its features, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. My blood ran cold as I realized that this was no ordinary entity. Suddenly, the figure stood up and moved towards the screen. The lights in the room flickered, and the screen came to life, playing scenes from the movie we had watched that night. But something was wrong. The scenes were distorted, filled with shadows and static, and in every shot, the hooded figure was there, watching us. "Leave!" The word boomed through the theater, shaking the walls. The figure pointed towards the exit, and the screen flashed with images of us, screaming, running, but never escaping. We were trapped in this nightmare. Panic surged through us, and we bolted for the exit. The door slammed shut behind us, and we ran until we were outside, gasping for air. The theater stood silent behind us, but I knew this wasn't over. As we stood in the cold night, we made a pact never to speak of this again, to stay away from the theater and hope that whatever haunted us would lose interest. But deep down, I knew that the shadow of that figure would follow us for the rest of our lives. We had seen something we weren't meant to see, and it had marked us forever.